everybody. I'm Ginger Zumaeta, the CEO and founder of Motive 3, and I am here with Nick Divincenzo, who is a culture coach and does leadership training with folks based on kind of an amazing background of sports and a bunch of other things. So, Nick, before we get started in the conversation per se, you just tell me a little bit about you and what you do.
Thanks, Ginger. I believe I'm uniquely slanted towards how a culture is built. And if I look at my background in sports, in family, and in business, I took very seriously what it meant to be part of those organizations. And so I spent my lifetime trying to be part of culture, growing culture, changing culture. And what I do is help organizations with that aspect of it. You can look at the performance aspects, all their systems, routines, their business models, and those are pretty solid, although I do help fill the gaps there as well. But the big gap in a successful organization is the culture piece.
So tell me a little bit, like how does a business know that they need a tune-up in culture?
A few different reasons, but probably the biggest reason, because if you have something successful and it's going to scale up, you're going to reach a ceiling. That's just going to happen. And then to break through that ceiling, we say kind of what got you here is not going to get you there. And what I consistently see over and over, like an organization going from, say, 1 location to 10 locations and 10 to 20 locations. Going to 1 to 10 is difficult, but the founders, the owners have this vision, this feeling of the culture they create, and they imprint that on people, the leaders in that organization, and that filters down. When you get past 10 locations, you can't be everywhere. And so if you don't, not systemize, but if you don't really take a look at how your culture is developed, defining it, and then how to successfully communicate it and grow it, then going from 10 to 20 is going to be very difficult. And some organizations make that breakthrough, learning about cultures. Others will shrink back down to what they're comfortable with. And that's just the way they operate, because it does mean giving up control. You have to trust people. You have to, give them some information and a taste of the culture, and trust they're going to do the right thing with it. And that's not always easy for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm curious kind of how this loops back to you said something that I should have followed up on originally. You specifically called out 3 things: sports, family, and business, as something that sort of got you into studying culture and wanting to kind of work on culture. So how does that relate back to this concept you're talking about in terms of, I experience it too all the time, right? When you're working with kind of small moving to mid-sized businesses, we do it on the messaging side because the owner or the founder no longer is the primary driver of the messages. They're one of them, but like you got to trust other communicators. And so I'm kind of curious in this sort of pivot point, if you will, how does that background play in? Help me understand that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the pivotal point for me where this started to come together, and I saw an opportunity to be part of something bigger, and that continued, was through, I worked for an organization called Earl's Restaurants. I helped grow that organization from 6 restaurants to 60 restaurants. And luckily, the owners were willing to go down that journey of what that looked like, and invested in I was a regional manager at the time, invested in the regional managers to be part of that. And that led us through, talking to some experts on storytelling like yourself, also on how to define your values. But with that, they provided a lot of leadership courses, or sent me to some leadership courses that I in turn learned how to teach those courses. And it really opened my eyes to the opportunity for performance when those two things combine, culture and your business model. And that made me look back to family, what's the culture in my family, what are our goals, and look back to my sports background as well. And I was always successful in sports, but I look back and how can I learn from that, and moving forward, how could I have elevated our performance as a team.
So tell me a little bit. I want to kind of drill down on the sports background that you're talking about. What's your background in sports?
My background is sports. My love is basketball. I played a lot of basketball, and just running in general. I remember in grade 3, they did, some physical testing, and I didn't think of much of it at the time, but the teacher pulled me aside and said, the way you run, you're going to do some good things.
Oh, interesting.
And so as I got into grade 5 and started playing sports, I always played above my grade. So when I went into high school, grade 9, I played with the senior team that was in grade 12. And so there's always this love of creativity in sports, but also you can give 110% of something, and it was exhilarating.
Mhm,
The
mhm.
other side of that is the team aspect of it, and yeah, I just really enjoyed setting other people up for success. And so the positions I play, like in basketball, I was a guard, which sets up the plays and sets up the team for success. And the other, if I've looked back now, and part of my story is culture. Like what was I there to do? And if I narrow it down to, I was there to do my best, and doing your best is contagious. And teams excel when that happens. So in juniors, middle school, we went 3 years undefeated on our basketball team. And that's something I always took with me. Do my best, and everyone else around you will do your best.
Yeah, that's great. And so, I think you're starting to get into something that, we also have a lot of kind of discussions around, right? And so, as folks that we get called in on the storytelling side, and I think a lot of times, I say this all the time, like, story is strategy and story is destiny and story is culture as well, right? And so I'm kind of curious about, how do you get folks to sort of subscribe to the same story to drive culture, or is that even a piece of what you do?
Oh, absolutely. It's pivotal, because if you hit the nail right on that, if you are in a culture and you're not connected to it, then you're not going to elevate your performance to what people call brand ambassadors, where they are connected to the organization and they're contributing. Now, the connection piece is interesting. And my journey has told me, the more I connected with my own journey, the better I connected with the organization I was working with. Because if you know yourself, you know what's important to you, then you can know if it connects with the organization you're in. And often people dismiss the organization they're in that doesn't match. But when I ask them, well, what's important to you, they haven't really been able to define it. So we do some work there. Am I?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I guess, one of the things I'm curious about is, do you ever find that there's just in that I'm curious, well, what does that process really look like for you? And
Yes.
what happens when there's a mismatch?
When there's a mismatch, two options. Sorry. So the process is is fascinating and interesting and goes in lots of different directions. However, if you just get people talking about their journey and where they came to, you'll start picking out, Nick, you played sports. Tell me about teamwork, or tell me about winning. Tell me, and you start to see what's important to someone. And you can start narrowing it down to 3 to 5 things that's super important to them. Now that conversation is, I think it's super engaging because people come away with a clear idea of what their identity is and what do they have to offer to the organization. And that expands during life. That's another side story, because as you grow, as you know, you get through life and you start thinking about, there's less summers ahead of me than behind me, and what am I leaving behind? And it speaks to legacy. That doesn't happen without that examination. Oh, my headphones just popped out. Okay, are you following me so far?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, and then your big question is, what happens when there's a mismatch? And I love it when I laugh when there's those mismatches, and it's gotten me into trouble because my wife thinks I'm laughing at her, but I'm actually laughing at, aha, now we have an opportunity. And in that opportunity, you have an opportunity to elevate. So maybe the organization needs what you have and you can elevate the organization, or what you need is somewhere else, in which case that's okay too. Go find what's important to you, ignite that passion and live an inspired life.
So it sounds like you're working with a lot of, I'm assuming, individuals. They might be individuals on the leadership team. Maybe they're individuals in the field or in the trenches. And how does it get all pulled together into sort of a master narrative?
I found, I'm sure there's lots of people that do this and don't necessarily use my style, and that's fine. For me, because performance is very important, that's the context where all this revolves around. So people are in an organization to connect, but also their contribution to perform. And once that connection is made, then we can look at the contributions and start tying things together. And fascinating situations occur. How many times has someone been in a situation where they see their boss do something and it doesn't sit well with them and they feel like they can't say anything? If that is a performance challenge.
Yeah.
So you have to work through that somewhere, because if you just take that home with you and the next time it happens, it's going to fester and fester and fester. And that's why engagement is probably the biggest issue in organizations these days.
And would you say that's sort of the leader's responsibility to clear that way? Because there's, and I'll bring up a little bit of an example. Maybe there's sort of this delicate balance between, when you've got a leader, you have an agenda. Certainly there's the performance agenda, right? But all of the things that sort of contribute to performance really have a lot to do with how was the goal couched or contextualized, right? And not only how do you make it sort of a logical, kind of tangible, measurable goal, but beyond that, fire up the emotions, kind of tap into people's values and get them to say like, wow, I'm a part of something bigger. I play a role. We do that with storytelling and kind of creating narratives and doing story mining, right? Like trying to figure, if we figure out a master narrative, we're going to then say, okay, let's have a little workshop where we're working with people on the teams, kind of framing out the narrative with enough of a kind of a skeleton, let's say, but then actually having folks fill in the blanks in terms of kind of putting meat on the bone, for how to build that out. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I do have a role in this. So I'm just kind of curious how you balance that, because sometimes there's like, these very charismatic, and sometimes very assertive, leaders that have a very clear vision, and it's just like jump on my bandwagon and let's kind of go there,
That's right.
but which I think you were describing earlier, it works to a point. After a point, you need to have other folks kind of fill in the blanks and have, so that they've got some ownership in the mission. And I was kind of curious, if, like, at what stage do you do that, and how do you get those leaders to kind of jump onto that agenda?
Excellent. Yeah, you picked out a very interesting point. It works till it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, you know, big moments in life. So like my midlife crisis, it worked until my life started crashing down on me. And so those mini crises happened every time something stops working. And how do you rally instead of blame, create fear, deflect, deny? And so that idea of rallying is, I think, better, like there's a rally story, like historically, some sort of rally story, whether it's the hero's quest. I'm not exactly, you're more of an expert there for me, but I know there's a story that when it paves the path forward, it goes clumped, like it's like a piece of a puzzle that goes in. That does not happen without, we say, looking in the mirror. If you want something to change in the future, that change has to start with you. So what is it about you that has to change? Because your assertiveness may have gotten you so far and it worked until it didn't work. So what do you do now? It's a crisis of identity.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit. So I'm kind of curious. Let's kind of drill down a little bit more into the specifics here, because we're talking kind of at a very high level. But
I was thinking
now
exactly the same thing.
now let's get into, for the folks that you work with, describe to me kind of like your ideal customer profile. Like, how do you know these are the folks that I'm for, and this is, kind of draw a box around them and know sort of how to access them. How do you do that?
It's a lot through referrals, because I think I have a pretty narrow niche. One, I've only been officially running my business for 4 or 5 years. And two, it's just me, the one employee. And three, it is something someone will want to invest in. So when I have a conversation with a potential client, if they're open-minded to what I'm going to say or what I'm talking about, that's a check mark in the right direction. Probably before that, they want growth, they want success. So what I do sometimes in an organization that's stagnant, they're not necessarily interested in investment. So they want growth, check mark. They're open-minded to what that may look like. But this third part is probably the biggest key, that they're vulnerable. They can look at themselves, because when someone says, look in the mirror, what do you need to change in yourself to create that change elsewhere? That's not an easy thing to do, because your ego is going to fight that tooth and nail. And when I meet with a client and right off the bat, we hit those 3 marks, then that helps. That says, hey, we have the potential of working together and doing some great things.
I'm just going to let my dog out of my
Okay.
office right now. Recording.
Ginger,
Yeah.
I have a habit of talking very vaguely about things, big picture, and so if you need to narrow my focus, feel free to like get really specific with me.
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now. So, you know, what I'm hearing is they're sort of growth minded, growth oriented, they're vulnerable, right? They're kind of willing to look in the mirror. But is this any business, any size business, any industry, any category? I mean, you know, in our experience, what we tend to find is unless there's kind of some, you know, fairly narrow swim lanes, it gets hard to move things from even from a pattern recognition standpoint, right? Like I've seen this problem before. I've seen how it has held some people back, how some people have overcome it, how some people can move forward. So I'm kind of curious about, you know, and I understand you're mostly from referral, but is there a niche that you serve beyond the kind of problem aware type leader?
For sure. My niche, because my expertise comes from hospitality, 30 plus years or 40 years in hospitality. When you experience those problems and you work through those problems, that is an obvious niche for me. After that, I went to build condo buildings with my friend owned a construction company, developer. He was all in one and he wanted to grow his business. So it was my opportunity to put those things in practice. And what I learned there, that it was all the same. It was all the same concepts, all the same underlying issues. When a group of people come together and they want to achieve a common goal, the issues that come up are the same. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. I have another referral. It's an IT company and very different model, very different set of services, all the same issues though.
And what are some of those issues?
Would you like to talk about on the business side or on the culture side? Maybe one of each?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. On the business side, successful businesses have it figured out. This is our systems, this is our processes, and everyone should follow them. Agreed. When someone starts having a crisis, a mini crisis of not achieving the goal, they kind of abandon all that. Because if it was that simple, just go back and follow the systems and processes and you'll be successful. And if you're not, go back and fix those and then you'll be successful. That simplicity of discipline of what services you provide, I think the simplicity is there, but can you execute in challenging situations? And often people, when things are going well, they speak like we do it all, this is the way we do it. And then once it stops going well, they kind of throw that out. And the reason they throw that out is the culture side. And let's say someone who's assertive, you mentioned, so someone's an organization, they're assertive, that like we follow systems and process no matter what, and that's what works. And then because their assertiveness comes into play and there's an issue that needs to get done, an assertive person can abandon all those systems and process in the sake of getting something done. So what they believe in business they do, in certain situations they throw out the window.
And so I'm kind of curious, how much do you, whoa, that is not what I meant to do. I'm kind of curious, how much are you rolling up your sleeves and getting into these businesses versus kind of just speaking with the leader and other folks and kind of having them kind of figure things out for themselves, because it's starting to sound a little, to me, a little bit like management consulting.
That's the management side. So the business side is the management side, but it crosses over to the culture side. And I can talk to you about that. But to answer your question about how involved I get, it really depends on the organization. So some organizations, especially hospitality, because I also have a background in all those systems and processes and profit models and how to navigate through that. I have that expertise to get in there. Other organizations, I can just see that issue and call it out when I see it, because it's when people talk to me, there needs to be a context of performance, and I'm fine having just culture conversations, but they have to tie together if you're going to do something with it. And like I say, some people want to get me more involved in the management side of things or not. I can do both. And for sure, my IT client, I have no idea what they do on that side. But when I see those issues come up, then it's easy for me to call them out. I don't need to be an expert to see that this is a problem.
And so paint me a little bit of a picture of theater of the mind here. So you get called in, you're talking to someone who they know they want to grow. You're probably assessing in the conversation, okay, there's a performance aspect that we're trying to get to, and culture, inevitably is going to influence that performance aspect. And so what's step one? Are you doing assessments? Are you doing interviews? Like, how do you get from we want to grow to an outcome, or even determining what that outcome is?
Great question. High level, there are assessments I do. There's a product I'm a certified consultant for called the Predictive Index. Not sure if you heard about it, but throughout my entire leadership journey and performance journey, knowing who you are and what you're about always translates into behaviors. And so I've searched, honestly, there's so many great assessments out there. What I like about this one is that within 15 minutes, I can get organizations talking about behaviors, which is something very difficult to do because people see behaviors through their lens. And so it's always filtered through. An assertive person is going to look at someone else's behaviors through their assertive lens. And if that person is not assertive, they're more collaborative in nature, they're going to miss that. And that relationship is not going to get in sync, or it's going to have more challenges to get in sync. So we need a behavioral assessment. On the big picture of the business, yeah, very simply, like whether it's interviews or a survey, what are you most proud of? What are the big achievements in the organizations? How have you contributed? What are the challenges that an organization will face this year? What are your challenges? And what do you think should be done about those challenges on the organization and for yourself? So I'm always trying to bring, because it's easy to complain about someone else. Mm-hmm. I'm always trying to bring, what are you going to do yourself to change that? And that kind of gives me an idea of where the landscape is. And then we get started on the work.
And then, okay, great. So then you've got sort of like all of these inputs, you're kind of comparing them all to each other. And the next step is to, put a plan together, or are you helping folks sort of align, kind of how do you what happens between, okay, I now have awareness of my lens and others' lenses, right? And now we need to start the work. Like, is there something that happens in between there?
Yes, we do some, first of all, every client's different. And so I really try to adjust what I do to them. And so what I'm going to describe is kind of what my prescription, but it changes all the time depending on what the organization wants. And so I would say there's three parts. The first part is this idea of understanding behaviors, understanding who you are, understanding the organization, understand the people you want in your culture. And so that's like a people segment of it. And those are the main points. And we just do the work. Behaviors is very simple. If you have an assessment that enlightens people that there are not everyone that behaves and thinks the way I do, once they become open-minded to that, then they can start having conversations with each other and curious about what is in the mind of a collaborative person. How do they achieve success? Because the way I see it, you cannot do it without this competitiveness.
I
And
see.
I'm proof of that. I am slightly more a collaborative than I am competitive. And I've seen huge successes in my life.
I see. And
Yeah.
so, okay, so now what I want to do is kind of let's bring this back to storytelling. Most of the time we're talking about storytelling. And so where do you see storytelling having a place in this process? And what does storytelling even mean in, for you in this process?
Great question. So I have a specific example, but high level is just context. I think storytelling brings a context to something. Like I told my kids that falling in love was important, but they wanted to know how me and their mom met. And then once I told that story, they wanted to hear it over and over and over again. And so the context, I think, is important to the story. So anything I do with my clients, there's a story behind it. And not every time, but I try to pull out what that story is. What's kind of going on here? If we were making a movie, what would this scene look like? And in every scene, there's going to be some conflict and some, inspirational parts and so forth. Specifically on that first part, if it's a day one workshop on behaviors, we start off, I tell my story, my journey of how I came to this point. This is how I got here today. And this journey goes way back to my family, my sports, my career, my own family, growing, my midlife crisis. Like the story can go on and on. I just pick out the high points, not to steal the show. And then I facilitate for them to tell a part of their life that they're proud of. And I try to get them to tell it like a story. Someone might say, oh, I'm really proud of this promotion I got. And then, oh, tell me more about that. What was that like? What was your biggest challenge? How did you overcome that challenge? And then a story evolves out of that.
And then I'm going to kind of go back to the overall sort of growth and performance side and kind of how culture fits in. The first time you and I talked, it was really about a company that is growing and wants to grow even more so, right? And as we talk, like the further, the more numbers of separation between that leader and all of the other people on the team, whether they're communicators or not. I mean, they can be very operationally focused, but as the organization gets bigger, in many ways, what we see is the story gets diluted, right? And then without a common story, behaviors, right? We always kind of talk about like, how do you almost have like a story operating system, right? So that
Mhm.
everybody is really articulating their performance, their behaviors, and the things that they do through the lens of a common story. So how do you, when things are kind of going from 6 to 60, as happened in your past, how did you see sort of a story as a driving force for how that was able to happen? And on restaurant number 59, they almost need to be inoculated with the story. I've had that experience with really big healthcare where a company that I was consulting for many, many years went and bought another huge healthcare company, and they literally needed to be rebranded, reoriented to a completely new story besides the one that they had worked for the last 20
Mm.
years, right? And so there was a lot of kind of culture building, storytelling, aligning the story. This is why this is such a good marriage, because we share the same values, we've been doing a lot of the same things, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just kind of curious, in that kind of growth, how does the master narrative kind of play a part in what you've seen? And maybe even more specifically, Nick, like, where have you seen things go wrong where it just was not managed well?
Great question. That may take us into kind of the second part of what I do. So people now understand behaviors, they understand who they are, they understand the organization as much as they can. And the second part is that 0 to 60. So what is 60? What is 100? Where are you going? And there's a process, high level process of where are you going? Like, do you want to have 30 locations in 10 years? Do you want to be the best at something? What is your vision? What's your mission? What are you going to wake up every day setting out to do? Obviously, your values should come out in that first day. And then what are the barriers? So we start pulling out all the barriers that are in the way. And some are going to be operationally driven barriers. So we can't get this cost in line, or we can't reach the sales target that we need to reach, or else we're not going to expand. And then what's the work environment barriers? Oh, we tell people what to do, but they don't do it. Okay, perhaps there's a performance review barrier there, or perhaps it's a training barrier, or perhaps it's a relationship barrier. And so once we get all these barriers flushed out, how does an organization resolve barriers? And can I reference a book?
Sure.
Okay, so there's a book that it was part of one of our leadership seminars way back, and it stuck with me forever. And it's called The 5 Dysfunctions of the Team by
Yeah.
Patrick Lencioni.
Yep.
Basically, if you only go after results, all these problems are going to show up underneath. However, if you build your organization on resolving those issues, results will just happen. So what kind of organization do you want to be? And back to that initial question about, who do I connect with? An organization that just wants to go after results and not work on this, they're not going to find much use in me. And
Right.
that's fine. There's lots of successful organizations that is their model. So now that we have all these issues, what are the things they need to work on? And the biggest thing is probably this way of communicating with each other, having meaningful conversations, candid conversations. And what does that look like? And we can narrow it down to this one thing. When you have a one-on-one with someone, Could be anything. You can just, as a leader walking by and saying hi to someone or sitting down with them in performance or an interview, you're always connecting with someone. So what is the purpose of that connection? What are you trying to imprint on them? And how do you go about it? Are you going to just tell them? Are you going to, nurture them? What does that look like? And so there's lots of options for people, but they have to practice doing it because we're not very good listeners.
Yeah, it is hard, right? We're always trying to impose our point of view, right? I mean, we're each kind of blessed with a point of view that has a lot to do with all of the experiences that we've had coming up to this point, right?
Yes.
And what we see with with team settings, and same, leaders that are trying to accomplish growth. Sometimes it's unsexy growth. Sometimes it's like very mission driven, kind of purpose driven growth. But the challenge with that is that there's always like all of these other stories in the background, right? Of all of the individuals, of them, et cetera, et cetera. And which is why I'll reference another book. A guy, when I was getting my MBA, a while back, David Logan wrote Tribal Leadership, right? And the almost like the fastest way to get everybody oriented is to find, the story outside of the organization, right? Because you'll all align if it's us versus them versus me versus you, or our team versus that team, or our restaurant versus that restaurant, right? If it becomes, no, we're actually all kind of like living the story where we're trying to battle a common enemy that's outside of our organization, you can get things aligned a little bit more quickly. And I think that when reflecting on everything that you've been talking about is, there is this real need to be listening for the other's pain point, right? I mean, that's the fastest way for me to get you on the path that I want you to go, right? Because we each have these, is to try to understand how your pain point, can be resolved by jumping onto this path and, us moving forward side by side versus kind of like on opposite ends of the table. So I think that going back to your kind of listening problem, but if you're not listening, you never really get to hear the pain point. And if you keep talking about we're going here, we're going here, we're going here with an unresolved pain point, you tend not to make a ton of progress.
Exactly. And that's Patrick's point. If you only go after results and not listen and talk to each other, yeah, there are organizations that have figured that out, but usually it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Now there's a good tagline. One of the people I was coaching, as I was talking about this, they said, hey, does this align with it? And often we listen to respond versus listen to understand.
Sure.
And so I thought that was profound what he said. Now, listening to understand, you need to slow down. Don't get too far ahead of yourself. And one of the most common leadership traits, I don't want to say leadership traits. One of the most common traits that I find when I assess leadership teams is they work at a faster pace because they have to go from one thing to another, and they're very good at that. But listening to understand is slowing your clock down and saying, what's important now is for me to understand. And so if I'm not going to make any assumptions, and I'm going to ask you questions, and guess what happens? All sorts of great things happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, as we kind of get towards the end of our time, Nick, I'm going to go ahead and turn the tables. I've been sort of grilling you about, like, all the aspects of your business and how you do it. And it's been, you know, really fascinating. I think people listening have a real opportunity to kind of sit and think through, is what has gotten me here going to be what takes me further, and what role do I have, that kind of looking in the mirror aspect, what role do I have, in terms of improving myself, to benefit from the ripple effects of others improving around me. But I'm going to turn the tables now and ask you if you have any questions you would ask me.
Absolutely. Now, selfishly, I want to ask questions that I'm going to benefit from. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Yeah, that's the whole idea.
Okay. I mentioned I can be very vague. You can ask me a question and I'll go off on tangents versus narrowing it down to being specific and focus. And I've been working on that. I've received that feedback, and the way it shows up is in group settings. I become very vague because I want them to create an experience, and then I facilitate, and then and the feedback is that can we get there faster? And similarly, when I meet a potential new client and they ask me what I do, the way I perceived those questions at the start is that it took me a while to answer that. And so how did you experience that? What do you recommend? What do you have questions about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so are you asking me how I experienced speaking with you? And then if there's any,
Let me ask, let's frame this around the storytelling piece.
Mhm.
The stories that I tell, are they effective? What would you recommend? Because what I said initially is what is in the back of my mind. So big picture,
Yeah.
you can see I start with what's in the back of my mind. And then when I see it, it's like, wow, this is a very vague question. Then I have to focus it.
Yeah, so it's funny when I work with teams that are giving like big business presentations. So I'll put in a slightly different context, and then I'll draw it back to what you're saying. So, I just did a couple of workshops at a, very big pharmaceutical company a couple of weeks ago. Amgen did 2 back-to-back workshops with 2 different teams on 2 different days, and they're telling business stories, right? And one of the biggest challenges that and these are internal business stories to get, approval, funding, gated resources, et cetera, based on their milestones. And in pharma, all the numbers are bigger, which it's, almost mind boggling. And the challenge that they have very often is they go in front of a leader. I ask them to kind of accept the leader's mindset to begin with, which is this: abundance of information, scarcity of attention. They have so many priorities, so many decisions to make. I mean, they're decision-making machines, right? Of great consequence, big numbers, trying to lead the company forward. And then people come to them with their thing, right? Okay, now here's my agenda. I'm going in front of a leader and I want, I'm trying to get my resources, et cetera. And this is ironic that the name of the workshop is called Get to the Point, right? When those folks come and ask for resources, and they, have 60 pages of decks and charts and graphs and tables, and, because they're trying to build up the understanding in the leader that they have, so that they'll come to the same conclusion, right? It seems logical. It's absolutely not what should happen, right? What should happen is the leader is expecting you to have synthesized all of that stuff before you get in front of them, and basically to get to the point. And how do you do that? I actually learned a great lesson. There's really easy ways. The most simple storytelling framework at its tiniest is simply, there is a context. You talked about that, a conflict or a complication, right? And a resolution, right? So even thinking in advance of how do I just get that across very quickly? What's the context? What's the conflict? And what's the resolution? The other thing, though, that I'll say is there's always a headline, right? And what you don't want to do is have somebody sitting there waiting for you to get to the headline without any wayfinding. And the best way to do that, I got this from this really good friend of mine, who was a former test pilot, actually trained Mark Kelly before he went up and had like the longest space adventure ever. He said even in military, training, they gave them this acronym that I absolutely love, and it's counterintuitive, and it's called BLUF. Bottom line up front. Because if you got 30 seconds with an admiral and you really needed something, there wasn't going to be the patience for you to kind of like get through all of the things that you needed to say. What you really needed to say is, I want to order 40 Apache helicopters because we're going to have a problem in this area. And, in 5 years or whatever it is, we need to get that done, which opens the door to be like, tell me more. And then you can kind of go through the entire backstory. And so I think that, one of the things that I advise folks to just practice all the time is bluffing. Like, what's the bottom line up front? And that requires something that you mentioned. It actually requires a pause. It requires me to reflect on what's the takeaway that I want someone to get after I'm kind of going to be doing this, this explanation, and then to just lead with the takeaway, right? And then you can kind of go fill in the blanks. But I think what a lot of folks have a hard time with is they're on a mental journey. And if the audience doesn't know where the destination is, we, on the other side, are trying to literally file all of these data points to try to figure out but we don't have the filtering mechanism to know what of this is important to the overall story and what of this isn't important to the overall story. And it causes the listener to just actually be in their mind trying to file and code this conversation so that like when you get to the end, they know why we got there. And I think that's a muscle like all other things. You've got to kind of really practice, how do I get that? And one of the ways to do that, Nick, is, usually you've got, a handful, like a little pockets of punchlines, in a way, and you mentioned the one that is, about listening for understanding,
Yeah.
right? You can listen to respond or you can listen to understand, right? And even if someone asks you the question, even just starting with that little punchline, well, you can listen, you can listen to respond or you can listen to understand, and then kind of go through it is massively helpful, because there's a chance that your explanation or whatever you're going to say is going to take the exact same amount of time, but it doesn't feel like it if it's driven through this lens of the point that you're making from the very beginning. Is that helpful?
Extremely helpful. Because I have lots of the punchlines. And so once you said bottom line up front, then I want to go back and look at all my facilitation notes that I'm starting off with that. Because I think that tells a story in a punchline. and that's what I've been working on is what is that story? But I'm doing it in a way that, because I'm reflective and analytical as well, so I'm not doing it in an efficient way. And so that is incredibly impactful what you just told me.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion with you. I think that, if there's anyone, especially in the hospitality business, but not limited to the hospitality business, that's really interested in this intersection of performance and culture, I think, and has that vulnerable, the courage, right, to kind of say, you know what, maybe I need to kind of look at some things in order to unlock the growth of my organization, reach out to Nick Divincenzo, which you can be found on your website, which I think is just nickdivincenzo.com.
Yes.
Outstanding. Thank you, Nick. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ginger. What a great experience I had today. Thank you.